Secret recaps here today. I'm going to explain an American horror film called Once You Take Care. A woman named Fred Evans travels to the United Kingdom after being hired as a nanny by a rich family. Upon her arrival, she immediately takes off her shoes and looks around the mansion. Because the owner is away, she is surprised by the arrival of a man named Malcolm. Malcolm himself, as a local delivery man who stops by often. Then Malcolm invites credit for a tour. Not long after comes an elderly woman, Mrs. Hill. Issue the house owner's wife, Mrs. Hill. Sure asks were great. Issues are greater shows where she had taken off her shoes, and she is surprised as they are gone. Mrs. Hughes casually says it is probably her son's doing. Then Mrs. Heelshire invites credit to meet her husband Emma. Here she also introduces her to the boy she is supposed to babysit. But to her surprise, this boy turns out to be a porcelain doll named Bronze. She laughs thinking it's a joke, but Mrs. Heelshire and Mr. Hill sure looks serious. Mrs. Heelshire tells Greta that many nannies had applied for the job, but Brahms turned them down because they are neither young nor big. The huge years teach Greta on taking care of problems, leaving her list of strict rules to follow. This includes reading to Brahms in a loud and clear voice, playing loud music for him, keeping the leftovers in the fridge, setting a mousetrap, and giving Brahms a goodnight kiss. Mrs. Heelshire tells Greta the Bronze is shy and only moves when no one is watching. Emma and Mrs. Heelshire that asked Bronze's opinion on Braddock Road feels strange with what she sees. Emma closes the door for privacy. Before long, the two of them come out and tell Greta they Brahms like Greta and he wants her to babysit. Brett calls her sister to tell her about her experience in the house the following day. Ready, here is Mrs. Heelshire, who is angry because it turns out that Browns ransacked his room. Then Emma here comes saying that they are going on vacation. These incredible, along with profits. Emma show some of Greta's schedules for the next few days. After they leave, Reed begins to ignore the rules, leaving Brahms alone right away, except hearing strange noises in the middle of the night. And Great immediately looks for the source of that strange noise. Wall in front of a painting coming right out of a wall to choker. It turns out to be a nightmare. Than Credit checks into Brown's room and sees tears welling up in his eyes. When examined, it turns out that the ceiling is leaking. That night, suddenly Reddy gets a call, but when she picks it up, no one speaks. In the morning, Malcolm comes to deliver groceries, and Greta asks a few questions about Browns. Malcolm tells her the Bronze was once a real boy, was the only child of Emma and Mrs. Hilshire, but then one day their house caught fire, and after not being able to escape on time, Brownstein the doll is simply a coping mechanism for the family to deal with their loss. Malcolm then asks her out for a date. That night, Gregory's break gets ready for the day. While on the phone with her sister, brother sees that Brahms is watching her, and she closes the door. Reddy continues to show. However, she was surprised to find that her hair has been cut, and her dress and necklace are missing. Greater than rushes to look for. She was lowered to the attic by strange noises. She climbs the ladder, and suddenly the attic ladder closes by itself. Right is locked inside. Malcolm comes to pick up Greater, and Greater shouts for help, but Malcolm doesn't hear, and he leaves instead, rather than try to find another way out. Then suddenly a huge shadow appears in front of her face, shocking her, and she faints. In the morning, when Greta wakes up, she is mysteriously let out. She explains to Malcolm what happened last night. It turns out that the latter can close and open on its own. Reed asked Malcolm about Browns once again, and he states that there are two rumors about. There are some people in the town who feel sorry for him, as they remember him being a very good boy, but on the other hand, there are others who claim that the boy was evil. Later, That night Brat calls her sister again. Her sister tells her that her abusive ex-boyfriend named Cole has been trying to find out where she is going to hate school very much. Red suffered a miscarriage after being beaten by Cole rather than gets ready for bed and brushes her teeth. Just as she finishes brushing her teeth, shares a strange noise from Brahms' road share purchase, and Brahms' room is seen very messy, with a lot of paper scattered. She straightened Brahms had we just tell them, and suddenly the head moves by itself. Just another nightmare. The next day credit goes to Bronze Roman, and see that Brahms has changed his position. He sits with your schedule to sign him, as if he is asking ready to obey and do everything is scheduled. Greta, who shocked, immediately runs to her room and tries to call her sister. Suddenly the phone as Greta answers the phone, a child's voice is heard telling Greta to follow the rules. Then a shadow appears under the door, and a child's voice is read. It now realizes that the doll holds far more secrets than she had initially imagined. The dollars to live rather than opens the door and sees a tray of food filled with sandwiches that Bronze has given her at that time. When it has mixed feelings, it turns out that Bronze doesn't want her, he just wants your attention. She then calls Malcolm and tells him about it, but Malcolm doesn't take her seriously. A scene later reveals Mrs. and Mr. Hills, you are writing a letter to Brahms which states, we cannot bear to live with what you have because a girl is yours. Now after reading this letter, both Mr. and Mrs. Hames your stuff their clothes with rocks and commit suicide. Greta, who now realizes that Bronze is only the spirit of an innocent young boy who wants to be cared for, is then starting to be nice to Brahms and do the things and trust to do. The following day Malcolm comes with a letter from Mrs. He'll share Mr. He'll shoot. He also asked right out for a walk that evening. However, Greta now feels responsible for Bronson refuses Malcolm's invitation. Disappointed, Malcolm leaves. Red is then surprised by Browns, who can move places by himself. The following day Greta asked Malcolm, become too sure that Brahms is actually alive. At first she fails to prove it because the doll only moves when no one is watching, so she then leaves the doll alone and it moves. Eventually Malcolm believes that night. Malcolm stays with the two, are spending their time together, but their activity is stopped by Brahms, who is possibly jealous. Then the two of them have a conversation in the kitchen. Malcolm realizes the Greta is getting attached to him. He warns her by disclosing the more detailed stories surrounding Brown's death. According to what he knows, when he was a child, Bronze used to play with another girl of this age named Alex. On Brown's 8th birthday, and we went to play with Bronze in the future mansion and never returned. Her body was later discovered in the woods with her skull crushed. When the cops arrived at the mansion to question the young boy, it was already burning down, and Bronze was later found dead. With this, Malcolm concludes that Brown's spear, which resides in the doll, could possibly evil. In the morning credits, abusive ex-boyfriend Cole shows up at the mansion intending to force Credit back home for greater safety. Malcolm stays nearby. At night, Credit has to dial for help. Cole wakes up and sees a message written in blood telling him to leave, believing it was done by either Greta or Malcolm. He becomes furious, realizing that prompted it using rat blood. She tries explaining it to him, but he refuses to believe her. Eventually Malcolm ends up joining them. Any two tries to convince Cole that there is a lot more to develop and meets the hold. It's a fit of anger. Any special difficulties? This is when the lights in the house start to flip. The house begins to shake and they hear noises behind the walls. Cole tries to figure out where the noise is coming from. Then suddenly the mirror full falls behind. From a hole behind it emerges a man who turns out to be the real now adult Bronze, wearing a porcelain mask identical to the doll's face. Runs, beats Cole and kills Malcolm, and Greta, frightened, run for safety. Greta and Malcolm discover Brown's room. There they find a doll made from Greta's missing dress, hair, and jewelry sits in Brown's back. From that room, Brown has been watching Greta all this time. Brown also finds the goodbye letter from his ears, revealing their plan of leaving Greta behind as a make-for-profits. Then Brown finds that Runs knocks out Malcolm, threatening to kill him if readily. Red is able to escape the house, but returns to save Malcolm. Arming herself with a screwdriver, she invokes the rules and forces Brown to bet. He asks for a goodnight kiss. When he tries to kiss her, she stabs him. Brown tries to cheer her, but she pushes the weapon and deeper he collapses. Brother rescues Mountain, and they escape the house. In the closing scene of the film, Brahms can be seen putting back pieces of adult together, suggesting that he is probably still alive. From all of this, we can deduce that Brahms never died in the first place. He was always a twist of little kid, and he ended up murdering family cribs on his 8th birthday to save him from the world. His parents burned their own house and faked his death and hid the walls of their grand mansion. It also reflects on why Mr. and Mrs. Hilshare committed suicide. Eventually, their guilt outweighed their love for their child, and they decided to end their own suffering. Also, there are several hints dropped throughout the runtime of the film that lead up to its big reveal. In the beginning of the movie, when Mrs. Hilshare tells about the rules of the house, she makes it clear that Brahms likes his music. This suggests that since Brown's lives in the walls, music or anything that is being read out to him should be loud enough to be audible through the Hilshare also seem to be very particular about keeping their house vermin-free. They emphasize on how she's expected to keep the mouse traps clean so that none of the mice into the walls of the house. Mrs. Hilshare tells her that they save all of their uneaten food, and it is pretty obvious that all of this food goes to Bronze. Mrs. Hilshare the Bronze is shy and only moves when no one is watching. This shows that the doll was never actually moving on its own, but was being moved by the real Bronze who lives in the wall. That's my explanation for the movie. Subscribe for more videos, and thank you for watching.